Welcome to this video. My name's Barry Beckham. The subject here under the heading of Photoshop for photographers is spotting the potential. But what do I actually mean by that? Most of us are now shooting raw files. We may also be exposing to the right. What that means is we're exposing to the right side of the histogram, which is the light side. We're squeezing as much light into the sensor as we possibly can. If and when we do that, then the thumbnail we view when we first open the image once it's on our computer can look quite pale, insipid and unappealing. So when we're viewing those thumbnails within Bridge or however you view them, we've got to make the jump from what we currently see to what the potential may be. In normal circumstances, it's not likely we're going to be looking at a thumbnail in isolation like this, but I do my demonstrating on a different machine and have to carry images from one place to another. In normal circumstances, we could be looking at this image amongst hundreds of others. So you can see we've got a little bit of a hill to climb in seeing the potential in the shot. It was taken at a place called Anna Bay in New South Wales, Australia. I'm fairly high up on the headland and it was a very gusty evening. Sun was going down over to the right just a little bit. And I was shooting with a telephoto lens, which is just a little bit unusual for landscape or seascape. Generally we're reaching for our wide angles, but here I chose a different tack. You can see down in the camera data that the lens in question was a Canon 100-400, but you can see I actually had it zoomed to about 310mm. The camera was on a tripod, but I must have been concerned about camera shake blowing it around because it is quite a long lens, because I've increased the ISO and I don't very often do that when I'm shooting from a tripod. I shot at 400ths of a second at f5.6, which is the widest aperture, and as you can see by the +1 there, I've exposed to the right, meaning that I've squeezed more light into that shot than the camera would have done if I'd left it to its own devices. Now what I've got here is the raw file opened up into Photoshop just for a moment. And here's a fact that some of you may be aware of, but maybe not all. If you sit down and manipulate an image like this in January, and then you go ahead and do it from scratch again a couple of months later, there's a very good chance that the two images you create look quite different. It will depend on your mood at the time, on how you're feeling, and how far you push those sliders. So what I'm going to do here is try to repeat a manipulation that I created with this image only a couple of days ago. What I did was to take what you can see here, and I created this image, and it seems to have been very well received when I posted it on a photo forum. I called the image On the Beach, and I think this scene looks quite isolated, and I think perhaps the cool tones, almost slightly blue, add to that fact. And of course you can see I've emphasized the sunlight streaming down out of those clouds. I chose to make it a monochrome because I didn't think the original image had any color that was worth trying to preserve. So as I bring you into Adobe Camera Raw to start this manipulation again, there is some risk that whatever I do this time will be slightly different from the other one, but I'll do my best to get it as close as I can and relay my thought processes as we go through the manipulation. I always start with the same things, and I know I've mentioned these in other videos, but they are quite important even if we are going to make a monochrome of this. So I'm going to go to my lens corrections, and I will tick the box to fix any chromatic aberration and also to enable the profile corrections. But from there I'm straight back into my basic tab, and it's around now where I'm thinking, well, I think this has got to be a monochrome. Looking up at the top right of the screen, there is an option of black and white. Now I'm pretty certain, although I don't want to go searching for it now, that there is an option in the preferences of Camera Raw that when we click this option here, it would apply automatic settings. But I'm quite happy to start off from scratch here and do things my own way. So I'm going to take the saturation completely away from the image, and straight away my eyes have gone to the histogram at the top right, because that's giving me a guide on what I need to do. I've exposed to the right, so I'm almost certain to have to drop the exposure a little bit. I want to emphasize the contrast in this. I want to be aggressive, if you like, with the sliders here. So I'm going to step the blacks down quite considerably, and I may revisit these quite a number of times. I may bring up the highlights, as you can see that histogram stretching on the right hand side, and the whites too. And to start off with, I may even ignore the effect to some degree on the sky. But I'm looking at the foreground and it still doesn't have the contrast that I'm looking for, so I'm going to go for clarity, which sort of puts in a healthy slug of mid-tone contrast. Now we're getting somewhere, and maybe I can even give a healthy slug of dehaze as well. And now we're starting to get some impact coming into the picture. Now, one of the things I'm fond of saying is that if we can walk away from an image sometimes and come back a couple of hours later or the next day, we often see things within the picture that we never saw at the time. Well, I'm not going to do that on this occasion, but what I am going to do is just switch around just a little bit. I'm going to leave the aggressive nature of my manipulation in the foreground and come back to that in a moment, because I am going to have to deal with quite a number of dust spots at the top right of the sky. I do want to remove people in the far distance, and also that person on the beach there. I just want the car isolated. I'm probably going to remove some of these, if not all of these, seagulls. They're just distracting, I feel, and certainly the one flying, and looks like I may even caught an eagle up there by the shape of the wings and a dust mark. So I'm going to set about doing those things first. Now, looking into my sky, I can see just a little bit of noise there. I've got the image to 100%, so perhaps before I actually start on the little marks here, maybe I'll pick up my detail and I'll just increase the luminance just a little bit, just to give that a tiny bit of smoothness. I don't want to take it all away, I just want to improve it just a little bit. But then I can select my spot removal tool, and by now I think you'll probably know just how this works. So I'm going to click around here and fix all of the little dust mites in the sky. There's quite a few of them. Generally speaking, once I get going, I do generally hide the little ring, and then I click around, and sometimes I can click around so fast that on one of my computers, and it's happening here now because I've speeded up, it actually takes a little while to catch up to me. I'm a bit too fast for the computer. But I am just clicking the spots, and we do need to take a bit of time to make sure they all look pretty good, and we may have to revisit this because I haven't put any extra tone in the sky yet, and I'm probably going to be aggressive with that too. Now, one of the things I've noticed when I'm looking for dust marks, I don't know if you've noticed this, but as you move the image, the little marks that are very faint seem easier to see when the image is moving, which seems rather odd. But of course we mustn't forget the visualize spots option that we do have down here. Maybe it's a little more difficult to see them here, but it's certainly going to help us, I think. So using a combination of your eye and movement and the visualize spots, we need to make sure we fix the entire sky. Now, as far as I know, I've got all of the little dust marks in the sky, but I won't be confident of that until I have another look when the image is finished. But here I've zoomed in way down the beach, that's why it's all looking rather soft. And I'm going to make my brush a little bigger because I'd like to take these people out here. Looks like they've got a dog with them, so I'll click to do that. Sometimes when I'm doing this I will reveal where the selections are coming from, because I don't think that was a pretty good choice, so we'll just adjust that and help it along. With the 4x4 on the beach, I'll just make sure my brush covers it. We should get a pretty good repair there. Nothing to stop me from just touching the V key every few moments and just taking a look. And if I don't feel I've got the ring quite big enough, of course I can also just make it slightly bigger, because I think I saw a little hint of shading there. And this guy with his fishing rod, we'll click him too, and you can see where it's taking the repair there. I'll adjust it a little bit because it seems to be a little bit wrong. Just fine tuning it, just moving that up and just looking at where it's producing the fix, hitting the V key. And of course I've got to bear in mind we are hugely enlarged here, 200%, so Control 0 will fit the image on screen. That enables me to zoom back into this person here. Looks like it may be a child, so I need to apologize to the parents that I'm about to take out their child, but needs must. Don't like the look of that. Let's hit the V key and move the selection to just beside it. I think that may be a little more effective. That's okay, I think. I don't think we're going to notice anything else. You can see that there's loads of seagulls around, and sometimes they do just detract or distract. What should be the right word there? Doesn't matter really, either one of them. And I've got a little bit of a problem here with a flying bird, which I don't want the bird, which is quite dark, competing with the truck. So once again I've got to deal with this. I think I'll just take a big brush and see if I can do it in one go. Control, just hitting the V key. What am I talking about? Control. Just hit the V key and bring the repair point up on screen. That doesn't look like the best of repairs, does it? I think I could do a better job using my healing brush in Photoshop. So maybe I'll just have one try at doing this by just painting across. Slightly smaller area, hitting the V key. Yeah, I think that's a little bit better. I'm going to leave some of the others just till I get it open into Photoshop, because I think they'll be easier to just touch with the spot healing brush. So I think I can come back and look at my foreground, because I still would like a little bit more impact in there. So I'm going to touch the H key to bring me back to the main tabs and back to the basic tab. What I'd like to do here is maybe do a bit of adjustment brush work to raise the tones in some areas, and maybe I can subdue them in others. I'm going to look at the sand coming through in these areas here, so I'm going to pick up my adjustment brush here. I'm going to just draw along there to create the pin, because I want to raise the exposure a little bit. Let's try that. You can see what I'm doing here. We're probably going to need to zoom in quite a lot here and adjust the brush size accordingly. But I'm just emphasizing contrast now. I'm just bringing the lighter tones in without overdoing it, but hopefully there's more detail between the lights and the darker tones, and therefore with a bit of luck the contrast is increased. And the sea, again, I'd like some in the sea as well. Now whether I'm going to just get away with that one adjustment brush or I need to add another, well, I think sometimes we will and sometimes we won't, but certainly I like the effect I'm getting at the moment, so I'm just going to stay with it for a while. And from time to time, when you're working with an image greatly enlarged, the danger is we go too far. So we do have to hit Control 0 from time to time, and I think that has put a bit more sparkle in the foreground. maybe a little bit round there, and a little bit on the edge, and a little bit round where the truck is more, because that's going to be the focal point. Anything in the distance there? Well, maybe. Now I'm looking in the immediate foreground, and I think this area can be quite dark. So I may deal with that with a graduated filter, but maybe I should look at the top first, because that's the next obvious thing to tackle, I think. So I'm going to pick up a gradient, and I'm going to draw my line from about there down to about there, so you know what we're doing here. This should be solid change, this should be completely transparent, and we should have our gradient in the middle. We can always move this around once we make a change. It will automatically pick up the last settings we used, and that's why it's making the sky too bright. It's going the wrong way, so I'll right click within that selection and reset the local correction settings. Then I think I will hit that V key to hide the overlay, and then think about where I'm going to go with the sliders above. Well, I think I'll start with a little bit of exposure and a healthy amount of clarity, and we're heading in the right direction. Maybe a small amount of dehaze. Dehaze is working quite severely here, so I certainly wouldn't take probably much more than that, not at the moment anyway. But we are beginning to get that sparkle coming through the image. Now I'm looking up at the top, and I can see a weakness in the top right corner and a weakness in the left corner. I could make this a lot darker, which would take the corners down, but I think I would rather tackle them independently. We could either use an adjustment brush, or we could just try another couple of gradients. So I may just drop the size of the image down a little bit on screen, because with my gradient tool I'm going to touch the V key to bring that one back. I'm going to drag one from the top corner just in at an angle a little bit, just catching the end of the gradient. A little bit difficult to see with the image this small, so I'll just touch Control 0 and get a feel for that. Maybe I'll drag it down a little more. You can see what I'm doing. That was pretty easy. Let me do the same again on the other side. I'm going to start my gradient out there and just bring it in. Try to get the angle right, maybe just on the edge there. Maybe I need to bring it over more. Down a bit. Over a bit more. Not getting quite the effect here. Maybe I'll just take it down a little more on that corner, and I'll hit Control 0 once again and the V key to hide all those, and now I've got much stronger corners. Now I'm going to return to an adjustment brush now, and I'm just going to paint into the sky there to anchor the pin. What do I want to do there? Well, I think just a little exposure coming down would probably do it. And I just want to wipe my brush down there. We may want to adjust the brush size in some places. I've got to be careful not to overdo this, I think. But I am just running them down there and just trying to bring out a bit more tone there. There's a degree of personal choice, of course, with this, but that doesn't look too bad. Then maybe if I go to the new option and create a pin in the highlights, we'll do something different. Let's just lift the highlights a bit, lift the whites a bit, and see if that will do it. Not making a great deal of difference. Let's bring up the exposure. Now we can see it working. But we've got to be careful we don't go too far, but a little bit I think. So a couple of brush strokes down these just to, again, I'm enhancing the contrast. Still not very much. Let's push it up a little bit more. That's a bit better. And as I've said, I think a number of times, there is the tendency here to overdo this, and I may even, can I get an improvement in the middle ground there with this brush? I think I can a little bit. But how far we go, well, it depends what sort of effect, the filter effect, that I'm going to apply with Nic Filters when I get this open into Photoshop. And I think I'm at the position where I ought to consider doing that. Now, I do have some issues around all of these seagulls in the foreground, so I may zoom in here first before I open this up into Photoshop and just touch some of these out, because they shouldn't be a big issue to get rid of. Let's pick up the brush, see if I can just click over the top and get rid of these effectively. Well, I think I possibly can, but I don't think you need to sit there and watch me do this. I'm going to just get rid of those that I think are obtrusive and try to just clean up the foreground just a little bit. Now, with the image opened up into Photoshop as a smart object, one of the things looking at the image, I get the feeling the image is tilted a little bit to the right. Now, there's nothing in there that I can say to Photoshop, this should be dead straight. But I don't know about you, but I get the feeling that the image needs to be rotated just a little bit anti-clockwise. So it's easy to do. I'm going to have a go at doing that with Control T. I'm just going to go outside the bounding box, rotate the image a little bit, and I may even just drag out the corner toggles just to fill the space a bit, because it's only a tiny little amount, and I'm sure that's going to be okay. I'll hit the Enter key, then sit back and decide if that looks okay, and to be honest, that doesn't look okay either. Isn't it odd? Okay, I'm going to live with my first choice, but maybe I'll choose to have another go a little later. But at the moment, I don't think I improved it very much there. Now, of course, we're working here in on a smart object, so there, if we start to do any work with the tools of Photoshop, we're either going to have to make a copy, which rather limits our ability to go back into RAW. So I think what I'll do is move on from this point. I'm going to go to the right and right click and rasterize the layer. I do have this, of course, saved as a raw file now, so I could go back into Bridge and open up where we are from this point, so we're safe up to now. Despite all of the tools we have in Camera Raw, I do sometimes turn to some of those in Photoshop too, such as my Dodge and Burn tool. So I may pick up my Burn tool here. Looking up at the top of the screen, I'm looking for shadows. An exposure rate, I think I'll work with 5% to start with. Let's see if I can get that to pick up with the keys. I just need to touch the picture first before those keys will work. There we are, 5%. So if I wanted to darken down the left corner, I can do that. Maybe a little more in the middle there. Just a touch more with those darker areas. And then maybe a switch to the highlights. Just a final touch. Wow, that was way too much. I never paid attention there. Look, at 50% that's massively too high. So down to 5%. Just one or two sweeps of the brush. There you can see what I'm doing. Down the wet water there to keep that sparkling. And a little bit more in the sea, just to bring up those tones a little bit. Anything down the sky? It's a little bit heavy even at 5%, so I'm going to drop it to 2 and just see, when I've got it set to 2, I have to give more strokes to get the same effect, but of course that's the positive thing. Okay, I'm going to have a look at placing a Nic filter on this, because I like to try Nic filters and see what they're going to give me, but I like to get my image as close as I can to what I'm happy to live with before I do that. Now I've just spotted another little speck in the middle distance. They're minute things, but when it's your own work and you spot them, you just have to deal with them. There's lots of them. If I start to go in, I can't deal with all of these seagulls, but if something just stands out and grabs my attention, then I will deal with it. Attention to detail. But now let's take a look at those Nic filters and see if we can just take this a little further. There's two things that I haven't done yet. A tiny bit of vignetting. Well, I'll leave that and see if I really think it needs it. A little bit of light sky up at the top right, which if I was really that bothered with it, it's probably going to be dead easy to just touch that with the spot healing brush, and that will be gone with no trouble at all. Now, the Nic collection of filters are free to download, or they certainly were the last time I checked. So go on to Google if you haven't already got them and download them, because they are well worth having. I'm going to go to my filter menu, down to the Nic collection, and the ones I want to look at are Silver Effects Pro 2. Because I've got a black and white image here, I want to look at the black and white filters, because I know there's one or two here that will just take that lovely contrast I've put into that image, and it will just take it that little bit further. But we've got loads of thumbnails down the left hand side, as you can see, and we can either view every one of them or we can see them in categories. I've got mine set to classic here. One of them that I often find myself attracted to is surprisingly, the underexposed one. Not in this case, but in some images that works extremely well. But you need to remember that you don't have to use it straight from the preset, because over on the right here you've got all of the options to temper the filter that's applied for you by giving it a manual tweak. So we could say, well, I like the effect it's giving me, but perhaps not that much. So we could bring it up a little bit. And the other good thing I like about Nic is you can just go up here and click the compare, see the before and after. Before, after. You see, that's looking pretty good, isn't it? But let me go down further, because usually there's a couple of others that I find quite appealing here. Here's one, high structure harsh, high structure smooth. Now you can see what it does. You pay your money and you take your choice. I like both of them, and when I do the compare, although I was happy with the contrast that I achieved, that's just taking this picture one stage further. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to accept that and click OK to open that up into Photoshop. Now when that image arrives on screen, and it doesn't take too long, you'll notice that the Nic filter effects apply the filter effects to a new layer, which is very useful because it leaves us with our original below. And once again, I hope you'll agree that the difference between the two is worth having. There's a lot more sparkle in the Nic filter, but I can notice now one or two little spots which may be dust, so I'll have another look at the sky before I finally put this to bed. And I think my foreground needs to be just darkened in those lighter areas. But before I do that, what I think I also did with this image was to look at one of the other Nic filters as well. Let's go back. Filter, Nic, and I'm going to go into the Color Effects Pro 4. They work in exactly the same way once they appear. We have, I'll open this up full screen. If I go to the top, you can see these are the presets. They're not thumbnails as before, but once we select them, we've got more changes on the right than we can shake a stick at. So all we've got to do is go down here and see if anything attracts our attention. Now if you look over on the left hand side at the moment, you can see the filter I've got selected is classical soft focus, and one of the good things about these is we can jump from one to the other using the arrow keys. There you can see I've just jumped up. So coming back to classical soft focus, color stylizer, colorize was what appealed to me as I went down this range. Now creating a blue tone like that in Photoshop is not difficult to do, but sometimes we just need a guide, someone to say, what about this? So as we go down all of these one at a time, we can see the effects of them all and if something jumps up and we think, well actually I quite like the look of that, we can decide to stay with it. Take my advice though, that even though, where was I? Colorize. Let's say I'm happy with that. Always save a copy of your monochrome one, and if you choose 3 or 4 of these versions, save them all together but with different names, because you'll find that if you look at them over the next few days, those that really appeal will stay appealing, and those that were just a fleeting thing you'll soon tire of, and they're the ones you drop in the bin. Now my other image had quite a bit of shading around the edges, so I'm going to try to recreate that because that was my feelings at the time. So I would have put a selection around here and certainly around that area and up the edge. Control Shift I is the shortcut keys which are the equivalent of select inverse. Select and mask, well, we need a selection on this line probably in excess of 400 pixels, so 450 should do it, and I'll output this to a selection which we can then hide with Control H, and I'll bring up my levels with Control L, but you'll find them in the image menu, and I can start to think about how much I want to darken the edges and the corners in, and that's looking a lot better on the edges. OK to that, then Control D to remove the selection, but I do want to do more in the foreground, so I'm going to pick up my burn tool. It's probably mid-tones that I want to take down. Let's try those. I'm going to push the exposure up a bit higher this time to about, I'm going to say 20%, and we'll go down to these areas here, adjust my brush. These are the ones I want to take down, and these ones here. I think we're sort of getting to the point where they could be shadows more than mid-tones, but it's working, and the 20% is forcing me to go over them quite a number of times. I'll push it up a bit. I'm going to risk 40%, and that's quite rare, but given where we're working and what we're doing, we'll get away with it more here than anywhere else. And I'll move right the way along, and I'll do any of those areas that I feel needs to be toned down. And finally we can view the image full screen with just a thin mid-grey line around the outer edge, just to hold the image in nicely from the black background and the dark edges. And of course here we do have the opportunity to view the original image, and we can jump between one and the other. But as we look at the original image, it's not an entirely fair comparison between the two when you think about it. We are shooting raw images, and we know that the essential part of a raw image is it's going to need some manipulation to get it anywhere near close to what we would have actually seen on the day. And of course, added to that, there's been quite a degree of exposure to the right here, so that's made the thumbnail look even paler and more insipid. But that's what we have to learn, because when you look at this picture, even looking at it as we are now, I can see there's no burnt out highlights, there's no blocked up shadows, so we've got an enormous amount of scope here, which I hope this demonstration has shown. Whether it's a fair comparison or not, it's quite nice to do though, isn't it? And to display the images full screen, I'm just touching the F key and scrolling through the views until I get to the full screen mode. Then I can just hit Ctrl 0 to fill the screen with the image I've created.